Okay, let's go on to rule number 3. The biotic effect, physiology rules. Okay? And when you think of physiology, I want you to think at the systems level as well as at the biochemistry level. When I ask you to think at the systems level, I want you to think of economic analogies. So a lot of what I'm going to be saying for the next 10 or so minutes, if you think economics, you're in good shape. So what do I mean by economics? Think about supply side, the rate at which something is supplied. Think about consumption, the rate at which things are consumed. And the balance between the supply and the consumption or the demand is going to be the operational point. So if you're operating a factory, you have a certain demand for your product and you have a certain supply rate for your product. The intersection of those two is your operational point. It's got something about how much stock you have in place. So what we want to do is to think of those analogies as we go through here. And our metric for the supply-demand interaction, the operational point, turns out going to be something that's called CICA, which is going to be the intracellular CO2 concentration inside the leaf relative to what's in the atmosphere. And here's the beauty. Carbon isotope ratio is going to tell you what that value is. So where's Sergio? Sergio, I'm not going to work in your lab making measurements every minute of every day for carbon isotope ratio CICA values. I'm going to let the plant do it for me. Remember I told you I want to work for you, but I don't want to be in the lab 24/7. I want to let the plants integrate that activity for me. So the first thing we need to recognize, and this is going to be old news for many of you, but not for some, and that is here's a cross-section of a leaf, and a leaf has photosynthetic cells and a hydraulic conducting system in the middle, and it has epidermal cells on the top and a waxy layer on the top and bottom. Okay? So we have photosynthetically active cells, water conducting cells in the interior, and then a layer of skin or epidermis that has a wax layer. CO2 and water don't move through the epidermis, except at stomatal pore openings. And the invasion of plants onto land, some 500 million or so years ago, provided the first evolutionary challenge for plants. They went from a wet environment to a dry environment. And so the evolution of the stomatal pore is thought to be a way for plants to regulate water loss. But by controlling the stomates, closing them down so that they restrict water loss, they also restrict CO2 uptake. So the evolutionary dilemma facing plants is how wide open should the stomates be to allow CO2 to come in? How close should they be to prevent water loss? Now, back in the good old days, like 4 billion years ago, when the CO2 concentration might have been close to 1 bar, 1 atmosphere, no problem. But over the last 500 million years or so, we've seen the CO2 concentration go from about 3,000, 5,000 ppm down to as low as 200 ppm. And at those points, plants get effectively CO2 starved. So here's the challenge. How wide open should the stomates be to allow CO2 to come in and water to leave? So that is the evolutionary challenge that plants face. And I want to put this into a supply-demand concept. So I'm going to say that water is supplied from the soil. And so we might want to think of soil water content as a driving factor. The absence of water is going to induce some sort of a stress. And the plant is going to respond to that stress by closing its stomates, at least partly. So we have a supply, and in the absence of supply, the stomates close. When the stomates close, that reduces transpiration. So the stomates are going to respond to a variety of factors, sunlight being one of them that I haven't listed here. But they're also going to be responding to this Greek character nu that I have, which is essentially going to be a measure of humidity. It's not exactly humidity, but it's analogous to humidity. So that's going to affect the amount of CO2 which is inside the leaf, because as we close the stomates, we restrict the CO2 coming in. At the same time, we have a demand for CO2, and that demand for CO2 is driven by the process of photosynthesis. So we have one system that supplies CO2 coming in through the stomates, and we have one system that demands CO2, that's photosynthesis. And the operational point between the supply of CO2 by opening the stomates and the demand for CO2 by its consumption is going to be the intracellular CO2 concentration. I'm going to call that an operational point. I'm going to call that a metabolic set point. It's not telling you about any absolute flux, but it's telling you about the ratio of activities or some trade-offs between activities. And it's exactly analogous to another set point that we have in animal systems. What's one of the most common set points that we have in animal systems? Let's say mammals. Let's say humans. I'll give you a hint. 37. Body temperature. We don't all have a temperature of 37. Some of us are 36, some of us are 38. But that your metabolism is affected by your body temperature. But when you're measuring body temperature, you're not actually measuring any physical process, any metabolic process. So in the same way that we could think of CICA as an analogy, we can think of body temperature as being another metabolic set point. So I need to tell you how we relate intracellular CO2 to carbon isotope ratio. And we do it with two simple observations. The first is that when 13 CO2 diffuses across the stomates and into the intracellular spaces, it diffuses at a rate called A, which is the diffusion coefficient I had on background slide number 2. That is a value of 4.4 per mil. So A has a value of 4.4 per mil, but the degree to which that factor is expressed is the same as the degree to which any fractionation factor is expressed. And it's going to be dependent on how much CO2 is on the inside versus how much CO2 is on the outside. So you see that A is not fully expressed. It's expressed as the ratio of A times CA minus CI, the gradient outside to inside, scaled, so divided by CA. So if the stomates were very closed and CI values were very low, whatever that is, you'd see more of the A effect. If stomates are wide open, you'd see less of that effect. B is the Rubisco fractionation that I mentioned earlier. That's 27. That's a much bigger effect. And the degree to which that enzyme gets to discriminate is based on the ratio of what's on the inside to what's on the outside. Because remember, CO2 doesn't have to hang around. It gets to diffuse in both directions. So the degree to which its kinetic effect is expressed depends on how wide open the stomates are. Oh my God. I just made a wonderful leap, establishing that if I can measure the CI-CA ratio, I can predict what the carbon isotope ratio should be. Or, going backwards, because I want to work for Sergio and I want to impress Sergio, I'm going to tell him what the long-term CI-CA ratio is just by measuring the carbon isotope ratio. Because if this equation is correct, A and B are constants, the atmosphere is going to be a known value. The only variable is going to be CI. So, can we test this? Well, of course we can test this. And this is something that we and others have done. So this is work that we did probably, 25, 30 years ago. You can take plants and you can put them into a chamber, and you can actually measure the CI to CA ratio. And you can, by measuring the isotopic composition of the gases coming in and out, you can calculate what the isotope ratio is for fractionation. And when you do that, you find that if you plot the CI-CA ratio versus carbon isotope discrimination, it fits on a linear line. That regression line is not a regression line. That's theory. Every time people have tested this, the data fit theory. This is a simple theory that was developed by Graham Farquhar in 1981 and first published in 1982. Many people have tried, many people have suggested that there's additional effects, but this explains well over 95% of all observations, maybe even more. So we take that as gospel, so now we can begin to apply it and use it. And we all like to go out and do our own particular study, and when we do that, we find that certain traits are affiliated with variations in carbon isotope ratio, suggesting that there's some relationships between form and function and how a plant's operating. So we can think about factors that will affect the supply of CO2. I mentioned stomatal conductance. Others are hydraulic conductivity, that is the capacity to move water up through the xylem. Others are cavitation sensitivity, that is the capacity of a plant to maintain the water stream under negative pressure and intact. Rooting distribution. So we find a number of morphological, biochemical, and physiological correlates that can be attributed or tied to the supply of CO2. Almost suggesting that there's a syndrome. Almost suggesting that there's a combination of characters that go together in some adaptive, sweet way. And then we find variations in capacity, or demand, such as photosynthetic capacity, nitrogen content. Well, we all know that most of the nitrogen is affiliated with the photosynthetic process, so that's not too surprising, and leaf area index. So we find a number of diagnostic tools that somebody as a physiologist or as an agronomist might be able to use. There are many more examples, but this is just to give you an idea. If you begin to think of things as supply and demand, some features that might be going together that are tied to carbon isotope ratio. Any questions? So the whole idea here is I'm trying to get you to think system scale, leaf scale.